Dudley is an archaeologist, anthropologist, historian, and several other things by trade, and was the provost at Coconino Community College 2016 to 2018.
Yeah.
And has since been running around the country. That's what he was doing before. He was at CCC as well. Dudley and I crossed paths at Western Wyoming Community College in Rock Springs, where we were both working there. Dudley has a great past and some excellent experience, and I know some of you already know it. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Dudley was most recently at the rendezvous at Fort Bridger. Anybody in the room get to go to, or on Zoom land, get to go to the rendezvous at Fort Bridger? Okay, Dudley would highly recommend it, right?
Yeah.
Dudley, tell me your position with the cultural arts.
So I was a commissioner for Wyoming State Parks and Historical Sites for 20 years. And then I'm on the review board for National Register of Historical Places. And I've served on that board for 44 years. So it's in Wyoming, there's not many people, and so they need volunteers. And you know how it is, volunteers get tired. Yeah.
They're saying it was hard to hear me, even though I'm using my really loud voice, but I'm not next to the mic. But Rusty, will you let us know if you can't hear? And same here in the room. We do have a handheld mic that Dudley will use if it's difficult to hear him. Just let us know.
Yeah.
All right, you're on.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more, just a little bit more introduction. Mike, I've known forever. I think there's one time we just had 3 people in the room. We talked about Mongolia, and we have worked in Mongolia. We've worked all over the world doing archaeology, and it's a long story. But I kind of want to go back to when I first started doing archaeology. I'm a Vietnam veteran, and when I came home, I was going to be a lawyer. And I would cut classes to go look for arrowheads. So I was kind of an amateur. And I took an artifact to a professor, and he said to me, he says, "Do you ever want to grow up?" And I says, "Well, not really." He says, "Do you mind getting dirty?" And I says, "No." He says, "You need to go into archaeologist. We'll pay you $2 an hour." And I says, "Sign me up." And so I have now done archaeology as you start out as a volunteer, and then you become a little bit more than a paid volunteer, and then you go on. But I've been doing archaeology now since 1975, since February 1975, and I've been doing it professionally as a what they call cultural resource manager, which is really not a good term to use because of the fact it doesn't describe what you do as an archaeologist since 1978, and I started with CSU. But I did archaeology in those 3 waning in between years as a volunteer, which means you don't get paid. And we don't get paid much now, but I'm an active archaeologist right now. I've not stopped. If you do what you like to do, you never work a day of your life, as you know. Why I picked this topic, and if you've heard this talk before, you'll see that it's changed. Why I picked this topic is we work on this every year. It's a process of working on every year. And the difficult thing about science is that information comes in faster than you can process it. And you've got to be willing to change your mind based on the data. And so some of the data that has come in about the granaries and the storage of grains or grain foods or foods that were used for long term that needed to be stored have changed. But what I'm going to look at specifically is what the area that flows into this river through here. 79%. Now you can argue this. You can go and get water attorneys that'll argue this. 79% of all of the water that goes into the Colorado comes from Colorado. About 11% or 13% or 14%, a high percentage comes from Wyoming. And then the rest of it comes from Utah and tiny bit from Arizona, tiny bit from New Mexico, a little bit of the other lower basin states, but none from Nevada. I could argue this, none from Nevada, none from California, but it's the lifeblood of the West. And it has been that way for 13,000 years. That's not something that's new. That's something that's as old as time. Because the intriguing thing about the Colorado River Basin or the Colorado River Basin is that you have these beautiful refugiums where you have great water and great resources. And then you have what you have down by Cameron, where you have no ability to grow any types of grasses or any type of grains. So I want to talk about that a little bit as we go. And I need to know how to advance this. I guess I thought I learned how to do this. Okay. Yeah, we experimented to see if we could get it to work. It's flashing the lights on. So the light's flashing on.
I think it may be.
It's got a blue light to it. Okay, so anyway, I'll talk about while she's working on this. So a long time ago, it's not been that long ago, maybe 20 years ago, but a long time ago, we got a humanities grant to discuss the Colorado River's compact. They sent people from Wyoming to discuss the Colorado River compact in Yuma, and people from Yuma to discuss the Colorado River compact in Wyoming. Because all states basically have to agree that it's a shared resource that comes through the water that it's there. The one thing of it is that the people that are dependent on the Colorado River and understand the Colorado River have a great appreciation for the canyons that the Colorado cut and also the tributaries cut. In other words, anything that's in the Colorado River Basin is marked by canyons. And the people that settled in the Colorado Plateau and the Upper Colorado Basin understood how to live in canyons. And the reason that I say that is why I started with Cameron. Inside the canyons are some of the richest resources that you can find. You have microenvironments. You have the ability to grow crops that are not necessarily capable of being grown at the higher elevations or at the medium low elevations. The elevations are out in the desert. And the thing about deserts is that you have a great amount of evapotranspiration. And talking about that, what I mean is that when the rains fall, the winds come and it evaporates it. It's like putting your hairdryer on cold. And when you blow across the back of your hand, no matter what the temperature is, you get a certain amount of evapotranspiration. Most of the moisture that we get in this area goes back up into the clouds or back in one way, back up into the atmosphere. It doesn't necessarily make it into the Colorado River. What the First Nations understood real quickly was how to take advantage of the moisture that fell. And probably one of the greatest success stories in farming are the Hopi to the east of us. The Hopi have lived on mesas there for 1,000 years or 1,100 years, 1,200 years, depending on how you want to put it. And they're contemporaneous with the Chacoans. The people at Chaco and the people at Hopi are at about the same time. There is some interface that's there, but they have been dry farmers and they've survived on that mesa for 1,200 years. The longest occupied place in the United States is up in the Hopi Mesas. So beginning in the 18th,
have to give me a wink.
Okay, I'll just say go ahead next. Beginning in the 1850s, systematic surveys of northwestern Colorado looked to identify granaries and stone structures associated with Fremont cultural tradition. I know you can read this, but I'll go with this if you don't mind. In the 1850s, Gilbert Wanger recorded the granaries as sheltered architecture and avoided classifying them as made storage structures, since in one case it looks as if they stored hides in the interior. The building of structures in the Colorado Basin is something that's also endemic, all the way from Wyoming, all the way down to here. There were structures built in the canyons. And the reason was they needed to store perishable goods. They needed to store items over a long period of time. And they became effective builders. Next slide, Pete. Next, we'll go here. So they needed to store perishable goods. Okay. And so the construction of these granaries are pretty intriguing. Now, I gave a talk about 3 years ago about them using organic materials, the clay, the mud, the stone, and everything else there to build this. Subsequent work by First Colorado State University's Laboratory of Public Archaeology in the 1970s and more recent research projects supervised by Dr. Jason LaBelle at CSU have led to both analysis of previously recorded granaries and finding additional granaries. And the finding of additional granaries is something that has occurred within the last 2 or 3 years. And the granaries that we found in the last 2 or 3 years, you think would have already been found because the whole area has been scoured. You think that the people have been everywhere, but they were so well hidden and they were in such high elevations, or in some cases, such low elevations that you would never imagine that there'd be a granary there. Where are they located where they're located? What do they accomplish? What is the purpose of those granaries? Next slide, please.
Try it again.
Try again.
Yep, keep my fingers crossed. Down.
Yes.
Oh, that's up. Go down.
Go down. Okay.
There you go.
Okay. The recent discoveries of previously unrecorded granaries expanded our understanding of where granaries are located and when they were built. This is a high granary that's up way high above the valley floors. You have to go a great distance to get to it, and then you have to put a lot of effort in making it. This is called Lucas number 1, and I'll come back and discuss this in detail. But I want to show it here briefly because the fact that the granaries are spread in all kinds of environments. Our area of focus has been in Northwest Colorado, but it's extended down into the lower basin, and I'll show you that in just a moment. Extended down into the lower basin in the Western United States. Now, this particular area that we've got marked off here, we've taken and looked at the specific environment. This is Colorado. The Una Mountains, the Wyoming Basin, Southern Rocky Mountains, and the Colorado Plateau are all in Western Colorado. It extends down to the border, as you know. It's diverse, and there's a convergence of 4 topographical regions. That's something that's kind of hard for people to understand, but you have the same thing in northwestern Arizona, the convergence of topographical areas or geographical areas that create diversity. Where you have agriculture in the American West, there's diversity in elevation and in soils and in water that falls. It's kind of intriguing. The Fremont are what they call the people who live in this upper parts of the Colorado Basin. And it extends, if you look right down here, all the way down to Lake Powell. This term is overused, but what it reflects is a people that have a behavioral strategy that has worked in this area. They have the ability to understand where animals are going to be at different elevations. They have the ability to understand where plants are in a different part of the area. They've got a grasp of the entire region, and they advance to what we call a complex society. Now, some people would argue what complexity is. Complexity is definitely New York City, Denver, Phoenix. That's complexity. There's a lot of complexity in those areas. What they do in this case is because you haven't quite reached the complexity of like a Phoenix or a Denver, where you have all these networks that flow to these particular areas, they have a tendency to call this the formative period, which is the transition between being hunters and gatherers and being agriculturalists. But the smart money is never invest in one thing at a time. For example, if you invested in the Studebakers and that's where all your money was right now, you're in trouble. If you've got to be able to diversify your portfolio, and that includes gathering foods, processing foods, making a living in a desert or an arid area that doesn't necessarily have reliable resources every year. What I prefer to call these people is the people of the canyons, because the fact that what they did was learned how to optimize living in canyons or along the edges of canyons and living up on top of the mountains. As you know, if the Colorado River hadn't been dammed up, there would always be water at the base, at the bottom of the Colorado River. There would always be fruits, there'd always be vegetables. All the animals accrue there. In the case of where we worked on the Gunnison River, which flows into the Colorado at Grand Junction, in cases where we worked at the Gunnison, they picked a place where only the deer could cross through there. Somebody was talking about how fast Colorado River flows. Deer can't get through that. Elk can't get through there. It restricts them. But where there are fords where they can cross, they will cross across. Just because, like cattle, they know that the grass is greener on the other side of the river. So they would come at specific areas. And the place that we excavated on the Gunnison River was where a ford was at, where you could come across, and it was river cobbled and it was shallower, and the deer could swim across, the elk could get across, all the big game could get across, and you just sat there and waited for lunch. You knew they were going to cross there. It was dependable. It's because the fact that the migrations had to occur through several areas. And what happens at those places, you have long-term settlements. And then there's one other thing that comes with the rivers. And it's throughout most of the archaeological record, fish. The big Colorado pike minnow, the things that you could process there, they were constantly in the river, constantly being refreshed, constantly something you could process. Our primary focus right now is going to be on the granaries. 5 recently recorded granaries indicate the diversity of the granaries in the northern part of the area, but these occur all the way down. They occur in Range Creek in Utah. They occur wherever you've got granaries out here. Here you have more, you have larger granaries than you do in other places because they had more corn. They had larger populations. Populations increase in areas where you have more food resources. This granary is this granary is really intriguing. You couldn't find it. For 150 years, people have been traveling all over this area and they couldn't find it. If they can't find it with as big as our population is now, they weren't going to find it prehistorically. And the idea was to hide your food resources. Because in some ways, it's easier to steal corn than it is to grow corn. Well, I mean, it's the same thing with money, but never mind. Okay, but in this case here, it's tucked in, and what they did was they used the naturally available stones. However, what's intriguing to me is the selection of stones. You can see that these are thin, and this is the roof. That's the lid. The roof and the lid are the same thing. What's on top of that is a pack rat's nest. The Kelby granary was the one that got us most intrigued, and I'll talk about this in a moment about settlement patterns in this particular area. But the Kelby granary is got beautiful masonry work on the interior. Just absolutely gorgeous masonry work. How many of you been to Chaco? With the Grand Kiva there, if you look at it, they've got these real small stones in there. And I've thought about it a lot. I have gone to Peru. I have worked on Easter Island where they've got large monumental architecture. And I've thought about it over and over. What is harder to build with? Small things that you have to inlay or big rocks that you have to move? The largest rock ever moved by human beings with manually is at Cusco, where the Incas moved it. It's just massive, just absolutely massive. And I think about this, is it harder to do this or to do the other thing? But why did they go to such great length to make these inlays? Why did they go to this point of doing it? Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. This is the edge site number 2, and it's real important. 2 separate granaries were recently recorded associated with, and this is where we become scientists. We have to do numbers, but this is the Smithsonian thing. At 5RB 748, a Fremont habitation structure, there was a 2-room pueblo by this granary. We excavated that granary in 1979. We did not find these. We excavated the structure in 1979. We did not find the granaries until 2013. So all that time we worked there, us great archaeologists who can find anything, were sitting right beside 2 granaries and couldn't see them. And why would that be? Was it to keep the kids out of them? Was it to keep the friends out of them? Was so when you had people over for company, you didn't show that you had so much corn? What was the purpose of this? What was the function of these? The 2 granaries indicate that even at a single locality, there are different types of granaries that are constructed in addition to what I just told you. This is a double granary, and I'll talk about that in a moment. This is a double granary, and you use the sort corn on either side of it. This is the edge site, which is at the edge of this is the edge site, that same place we're right there. But you look at this is coiled adobe. Now, adobe comes from the valley floor, and they carry the adobe up. You carry the heaviest thing the least farthest, unless you're an Easter Islander. And if they had a land bridge between Easter Island and Chile, there would be moais all the way across. And guys, I love working on Easter Island, but I just think about this a lot. That is a heavy thing to move. But in this case, you're going to bring up your coiled adobe up to these high elevations. This is about 300 feet above the valley floor to where this point is, 200 to 300 feet. You have to carry water. We've actually had to repair a granary, which I'll show you in a minute. You have to carry water. You have to carry the mud. You have to carry the aggregate to make it hold together. Aggregate would be the pebbles within inside of it. You have to carry the sticks. You have to carry all these things. So how do you make it efficient to bring these things up here? You coil it. You make it down in the bottom. You coil it. You carry it up, and then you work with it. And you can see the coils in here. I'll explain this in a minute. You can see the coils in here. But what you're doing is you're creating a granary that seals out rodents and that makes the corn stay fresh through the entire year and to ensure you have seeds in the following year. Sometimes we think these smaller granaries that are tucked away where nobody can find them is where the seed grain is for the next year. So that no matter what happens or no matter what tribulation you come through during the course of the year, you have the seeds for the following year. Because that's something that shows consideration and also shows a high degree of intelligence because you're planning for the future so that you don't lose your upcoming crop. You've got to be able to have something to plant in the next year. That could be one part of it. This is the two-room structure that sits in front of it, the 2-room pueblo that I was telling you about. It's not really a pueblo because it's just 2 rooms, but it's called the edge site. The 2 granaries are to the north of it and to the south of it in highway tucked away areas, but the construction method is different. If you weren't trying to seal things out, you would do the same thing in this kind of construction, where you'd make sure that you had filled in every one of the niches, that you don't have as good of sealing in there to keep the rodents out and everything else like this. Here, you just want to make sure your stone is level and that you keep heat in and wind out, so that in the wintertime you have a sealed place for working. Okay, this is the dry laid portion of the walls, and they don't even chink this part of it. They're not so much worried about it. This structure is another one that we found that is above the White River, which is a tributary to the Green, which is a tributary to the Colorado. I could give these stories all day long about tributaries, but this is a tributary area. It's exactly 1 mile up from the White River. Now, I don't mean it goes from that elevation to 1 mile up. I mean, to get there, you have to go 1 mile up, and the change in elevation is about 400 feet. So it's quite a torturous climb. Why do you put something up here? Do you have raiders coming in and stealing your corn? Are you putting it up here for the same reason I said about seed? Why do you put these things in these particular elevations? And I think that it comes from the fact that possibly these people moved. And because the fact that they understood the Colorado Basin, you don't stay in one place too long, or you exhaust the resources at that place. Very few places you stay a long period of time, especially in the upper part of the basin. You move, but that's good, because in moving, several things happen. You move away from insects, where insects have accumulated. You move towards where the resources are better. You take advantage of high elevations and low elevations. And except for during the time when you're growing your corn, you really don't need to be there if you don't have any enemies. Now, that's a different story. The increasing number of maize dates from granaries is enabling us to slowly develop a clearer understanding of the settlement patterns and what granaries were used at the same time. And this is something that I didn't have when I gave you guys the first discussions about granaries. We now have about 200 dates from maize, and that's real tight. Anything that grows annually only absorbs radiocarbon or radiation from the sun during the year which it grows. So when it dies, you can get it real tight. We have plus or minus 15-year dates on these things. So it's almost like having a calendar and saying this was occupied at this particular period of time. These places I'm showing you, this is a little bit of I'm giving you a tell right here. The places that are occupied that we see right here were principally occupied between 900 AD and 1100 AD. A 200-year window. What happened? We're not going to go into that too much, but what happened? They still would continue to grow corn. They would still continue to harvest wild seeds, and they'd continue to store them. This is one of the more elaborate granaries that we found. And for those of you that have seen this before, I like showing this because first off, it was hard to find. You had to get down, lay down, and crawl in under an opening this wide. Inside there was enough for you to stand up inside of it, but they took this and didn't make it with stone because they weren't worried about people breaking into it. They thought they could hide it. So it was made with what we call wattle and daub. You can see the latticing from the willows. It was covered completely with mud, but they did have one problem. Rodents would burrow into it, so they'd have to put patches. So every time you see them, the one thing you know that's happening is that there are pack rats coming in and going after the food. A corn cob from this granary dated in 990 to substantiate that date. In this particular case, we got a corn cob dates from 900 to 1140, but we had over 295 corn cobs from that. It's actually 312. But the reason it's different than this, 295 were found in situ, which means they were found in place, so we could date them. This is in 1977. This is after the roof fell and collapsed behind it before. And I think I've told you this, we restored this and we excavated this and we took this all apart and dismantled it and reconstructed it because we were paid to reconstruct it. So we reconstructed it, and in the process, we learned a lot about the way things were built. So you see the coursing of, here you got your foundational stone, this always placed on bedrock, always placed on bedrock. You see your early coursing stone, you see your mud, coarse stone, mud. Then you have a roof that goes on top of it that's made out of cedar and that's made out of willows. And what we learned from this is, first off, we already knew how they cut wood. We learned from this that you burn the edges of it and you chop it with your stone tool. You don't just go chopping away with your stone tool. You burn the edges of it, ring it, and then take and cut it with your adze or whatever you've got. Two things happen from that. You take the charcoal, when you're trimming these down here at the site, you take the charcoal from that and throw it inside of your granary because it drives out any insects that would come in there. You mix it with ash. So when you're cooking there, you drop ash inside of your granary. You can clean it out every year, but the ash and the charcoal keep insects from coming inside of your granary. They had what we would call some insect repellents that were working for them at this time. Pack rats are a different story. In the case of this roof, because of the fact that they didn't want it to be too heavy, they used corn as rebar to sustain the roof. So they took the corn cobs that they had inside of there and they put it inside of the adobe, and they used that for backing. For those of you that done construction, you know the importance of rebar to hold together your mortars. So this is critical. What this did, however, was give us good data on what type of corn we have. What type of corn and where the corn come from. You count the rows, you can compare it to what you have down here. The fingerprints inside of this give us a good idea of the people who touched it. And I really like fingerprints because that shows you the humanity of what these people are doing. But what we learned in this process is what I was talking about in coils. You carry the coils up because you have to carry them so high away from the water and from where the mud is and where the clay is. You put them in coils and carry them up, and then you pinch the coils together when you get them there. You can see this, you can see the edge of the coil right here. You can see the edge of the coil right here. And because we're a little bit of scientists, we tried to prove that more directly, which I'll show in a minute. Okay, this is rock removal from when we're taking apart the granary. And this is right before we start the restoration. We put in a French drain at the bottom of it so the water would flow out of it. And it's now stood for 20 years. I gave them a 10-year warranty on it because they got their money's worth. This is 203 when we finished it. So it looked like it was, you remember the 1977 photograph? It looked like it pretty close to what it was. You get a lot of snow here. And what's intriguing about this location here is that we think it was occupied year-round. Two critical resources in the winter is fuel, number one, and two is water. And the third is food. If you can store enough food, you have it made. This is the granary in 2009, and I'm going to show you a map of this area. This is 223. In this area here, there were 7 granaries that we know of. Wait a minute, I lied to you. 5 granaries that we know of. There are 5 granaries that we know of. So you have enough food to store here for a substantial population to live at this particular area. This is a double adobe granary. And these are the location of the granaries. This is the one that we restored. A is the one that we restored. B is an area where they cook the corn cobs. C and D are the other 2 granaries that you just saw, the double granaries. The double granaries are together. And this takes us to another thing, because I did say I was going to talk about rock art. These are the granaries right here. I have to be careful to keep out the information about specifics because of the fact that people go in and tear it up. These are where the granaries are. So you have the granary here at 702. 705, and then this has got 3 here. This is the 4th one, and the 5th one is, well, the 5th one would be calculating this one in 2. So you've got the granaries, but then you have habitation areas. So you have rock art and you have sheltered camps. These are campsites here, shelter camps where they have actual construction that are there. Your granaries are not near your habitation sites, just like they were at the edge site. You put your granary away from the habitation site, which kind of suggests several different things. Number one is they just don't want you going into it. This is, again, corn cob from the 702, the one that I just showed you. The rock art is an articulation of who we are, what we believe, and what we think. This panel is quite elaborate. Unfortunately, because of the fact that it's against the sun, you cannot see the stuff that's in ochre. I'll show you this in just 1 second. I've enhanced this. I've enhanced this a little bit right here so that you can see the red figures here. So you have a human right here, or a trapezoidal figure, and I'll show you better trapezoidal figures in just a moment. You have a trapezoidal figure there. It's really hard to elaborate on this. Then you have this octopus. So we know the ocean came all the way up to, I'm joking, we don't know what, we don't know. And so, because, first impressions are everything. In this case right here, you have 3 anthropomorphs, and then you have these footprints. Footprints are fairly important to these people that live in this particular area in Northwest Colorado for reasons that we're not quite sure of. They might be demarking trails. They might be demarking where animals go. Those are like deer tracks. This one up here is fairly intriguing. I don't have the ability to draw this, but if you look at this, you notice the discoloration here. In some cases, we have trapezoidal figures that Fremont made their people in trapezoidal forms, and they pecked them. They filled that in with adobe, and then they painted on the outside of it. That might be a necklace on a full trapezoidal figure. And some of the ones like up in northeastern Utah are 8 feet high. They're heroic in scale in sculpture. They at the McConkey Ranch, they're just massive. They're just massive. So you put the mud on the top of it and then you paint them. But in this area where you've got these granaries, you have an articulation of ceremonies, you have an articulation of things that are there, and they probably are contemporaneous. The student of mine that's standing right here is taking a photograph of the rock art. So you can see how high up this is. In 9 Mile Canyon in Utah, you have to kind of scale down to be able to articulate some of that rock art. It's very remote. So just like the granaries, they're high. And I used to joke about this in 9 Mile Canyon is they just wanted to prove how good of climbers they were is why they put that stuff there. No, there's something else going on. And Renee Barlow, who was an archaeologist, said, we've since lost, she passed away. Renee Barlow used to think that they were high cupboards to keep people from getting to things, to keep them from getting to specific granaries and stuff like that. But that's not why this rock art's here. This rock art is here so that it catches light. Louis Binford says, he's a famous archaeologist that writes about these things. He said that light is an artifact, and you want to situate your rock art panel so it catches the light that you want to show. You guys know about Fajita Butte at Chaco, right? You guys know about the summer solstice coming in on the spiral. On the Hopi Nation, they have one just like that for the summer solstice that shines on the west side of the canyon when it comes up, when the sun rises, and when the sun sets, it hits on the west side of it. So that in this Inca-Rinconada, which is a horseshoe shape, you have it on both the sunrise and the sunset. We think that in some cases, this is not for solstice purposes, but it was articulated so it could take advantage of the light so that you could see it as it goes. In one rock art panel that's to the south of this that I found in 1978, I'm not trying to ring my own bell here, but I actually did find it. I'm going to tell you a story. So it's a beautiful panel with feet like this and stuff like this, and it's like a story panel and stuff like that, right? So I thought there's got to be a burial up here because it was a one-footed person. So I climbed on the cliff and dropped down into it. And I was young, stupid, had no one else with me, and I fell off the cliff. Well, I figured at that point in time that I should not let this be a free fall. So I put my arms up against the cliff, and of course, I ripped up my shirt. And of course, I was skinned all the way down. The road rash was impressive, but I landed on the ledge, and I'm here to tell a story. But at that particular rock art panel, the sun comes up and it strikes this side from the east. So this, the same on this, strikes it on this side and then it unveils it. It reveals. It's like a reveal. So it wants you to see the story as they want it told. Now, what does it mean? What is it saying? I can't say for sure. And anybody that does archaeology and anybody that does rock art can get an argument going in 10 minutes if you say, this is what this means, that's what this means. There's some stuff you do know. Adjacent to the granary that I showed you that we restored is this human figure right here, but its articulation is not as good as the other ones. That's just simply because rock wears away. It's older. These right here are footprints. This is a bear print right here. This is a paw print. These are from bears. Bears are articulated. I know it's not very good, but the reason I'm showing you this is within less than a quarter mile of the granary. So that's why I'm showing it. So is this one. Now, remember, I really shouldn't have said that octopus because I tell people that work with me, when you come to a rock art panel, don't say this is what this is. Let's record it. Let's talk to other people and not say it. But this actually has the same quality. It's not like an octopus, but it has the same quality. What are they trying to articulate? What are they trying to explain? And you can see this trail that's right here. The interesting thing is that some of this rock art in this particular area have corn plants grown on it, because this is part of what they do. This is at West 4 Mile. And what this is like we talked about the summer solstice. When summer solstice comes across, when the sun comes up, it strikes through. So beam of light comes down through the center of it, and it provides a calendar. Light is a lot of different things. So for people that are growing crops, I'm going to pause right here and not advance this for a minute. For people that are growing crops, it's essential that you know day and time. it's essential that you might have predictors about what the day it is near the places where you're growing your corn, when to harvest, when to plant, when to pull it in and out of the ground, etc., like this. They would start planting the corn. It's summer solstice. It's summer solstice. The one thing about the National Science Foundation projects that have helped fund our studies here and that have helped fund the ones in Mongolia, specifically the ones in Mongolia, a lot of this has been volunteer work, but the ones in Mongolia is you get to look at people who live at a level where they're dependent on animals and they're dependent on what they can grow where they're at. Where you have to grow where you're at, you have to have pneumix or ability to predict when the season is. Because if you plant your corn before that solstice in these higher elevations, because I've brought this up several times, you have danger of frost. Here you don't have that. But they say that that's the time to plant it. The corn that they grew, some of it germinated within 70 days. Some of it germinated reached the full ability to grow it within 2 months. It had 2 months, so 60 to 79 days on some of the corn that they were growing in this area, but not all of it. And I'll show you that in a minute. Douglas Creek and its tributaries have a rich formative period tradition, especially in the years between AD 900 and AD 1200. And just to give you an idea, Douglas Creek flows into the White River flows in the Green flows into the Colorado. And the Green River is a real important tributary to the whole Colorado system. But you've got this system that you can see shadows of it here, and probably it originated here and then spread north. Now, working in Utah all these years and working from Wyoming all these years, nobody wants to think anything originates in the south and comes north. Everything originates from the north and comes south. But there are some things that disprove this. For example, the horse came from the south, and so did corn. So the corn, they developed this concept of when to plant, but what they did was modify it to the soils and to the rain and to the conditions they had there. These type of petroglyphs, these trapezoidal figures, are right across from the granaries. These have, unfortunately, through time and erosion, this is not vandalism, have fallen apart. But going back to this 1 second. Lost my ability to advance. Okay. In the Winger granary, you can see how it's tucked away. Okay. This is the edge site that I showed you earlier, and I'm going to end with this in just a moment here. This is the edge site that I showed you just a minute ago. This is one of the granaries, and the 730 is another granary, and 726 is also a granary too. There you have 4 granaries. I think that the higher the population density, the more granaries that you have. This granary, you can plant the corn down here. This granary is the Lucas granary, and it's high above the floor of the valley. Same thing with the edge site. They're high above the valley. They're at a point where it's very difficult to get to. This is again those granaries there. I want to go through this a little bit quick, so we're going to have the movie phase for a moment. 730. These sites are all taking advantage of this one particular area to plant the corn. And why this is so important is water flows down in high runoff seasons from this area here. It flows off from that area here. It flows from these canyons here to the side. And what happens is you have a pool of moisture in this area, so that if you don't get rain in one part of your area that you're farming, you get rain in another. And because of the high velocity of, you guys understand thunderstorms, you understand the monsoons, high velocity of water, then you're going to have this ability to grow more corn. You're going to have more accumulation of granaries. You're going to have greater amount of rock art in these particular areas. This structure here was out on the floodplains. You can see the daub. You can see this level in the center. So between the 2 daub lines, it's fairly level. And we had a corn cob in there because this was a granary that was grown in that point. That's me in 1978, and you can't see my face, so that's good. That's the type of granary we thought that they had built out there. So this is back to the Kelby granary, and this is what I'm going to end on. Remember I showed you the interior of that? What does that look like to you? Huh? Yeah, it looks like a pile of rocks. And I think that's because they wanted to mask that it was there. At that high of elevation, you don't have somebody watching it. You don't have the village dogs. You don't have the village domestic animals to tell you that somebody is coming. There's nobody to warn you that this is happening. So you're putting it up there so that nobody can get it. Now, I have to I'll go forward with this, but it looks like rubble, but it's not. You can see how well the lines are articulated in this. You can see how well they're made. You can see how well the foundation is slabs, the upright vertical slabs, and then you can see how well the interior is made. But on the exterior, it looks like rubbles. Okay. The interesting thing that we get with these particular granaries, and this isn't a good one to stop on and show you, but what we get in these granaries is that in these small granaries that are up high, the front is missing, except for the ones that are well hidden like this one. It looks like that when they abandoned the area, that they pulled apart the granaries by pulling the front out and getting into the catch. And they went into the inside of it. Now, it could be that when they were raiding, that when they were raided, they destroyed the granary to get the corn because they wanted to get out as fast as possible, get out and go home. Renee Barlow, who I mentioned before, said that was one of the reasons that they built granaries where they built them. It's one of the purposes that they had for building those granaries. I think she's right. I think that probably there was raiding and trading because sometimes people would pass through on their way to different places and it was easier to get the corn and raid the corn. So if you were going to stay there in that area, you want to protect your corn because they didn't have the high density of populations that you had down here. So they used masking of the granaries, the hiding of the granaries at high elevations in areas that were in recesses around their habitation areas so that they could protect them. The big, large mammoth granaries, I believe, are at sites that are occupied almost year round. I can't prove that, but I think that they were in areas that were occupied year round so you could protect your larder, that you could protect the items that are stored there. In places where you have the large ones, like the one that we restored that I showed you the 300 corn cobs came out of, that area has a high occupation area and there's a fortified structure up above. So they had fortifications at that point that they could protect that particular area. They could actually monitor that area. The other one, the one that's the first picture when you saw the slideshow, it's got the same thing going on there. There are 5 granaries at that particular location. I think it's occupied year round. And it's by, I have to not give the specific location on this because it's never been vandalized and it's quite amazing. That particular site is by a major habitation site to the north. So I think the larger granaries are for those areas where they're living. The smaller granaries, I think, are where their fields are. And that takes us to one of the other things that I wanted to emphasize here. You don't just put all your money at the granaries down in the valley floor, where I showed you where all those freshets came together. If you have a real bad monsoon season, you have a real bad flash flood, it wipes out your crop. If you've got crops growing up on the side of the hill in areas that are upstream or in places where you don't have that high velocity of water, you can store your grain in that smaller granaries, but they're away from the village. They're away from where your village is at. So you have to put your granaries in recesses that are hidden and protected from sites. You can't, you don't see them there. Low investment in the construction because they're not that big. High investment in the field that's down there, and you want to protect what you have. But the fact of it is because those were all pulled open. Most of them are pulled open, except this one right here. Most of them are pulled open and people get access to. I think they're put in an area where they're growing less crops and they're storing crops that are right there. Now there's about 1,000 more things I wanted to tell you, but I have to come back. I'm going to open it up to questions right now. So I talked a lot. Do you have questions? Hopefully.
They're really difficult to get to. How do you think they access them?
Well, the Kelby Granary, the first time we went up it's up a talus slope. And what you learn is that if you want to keep people out of where you're going to be, have dirty rock. Because I mean, the landslides that come down there are just incredible. So when you're walking up the talus slope, you're taking your life into your own hands. Because dirty rock is really dangerous to any mountain climber. I don't care how old you are, how good experience you are. Dirty rock is bad. But I think what they did at Kelby is I think they accessed from the back side of it and came around the back side of it when they were putting in their corn. I think that people were just going up to look for it, would try to go up these talus slopes and they couldn't find it because it's almost impossible to climb. So I think for the locals, they had paths that took them to those locations. Did I answer your question?
Oh,
kind of.
Sometimes I wondered if they use rocks or ropes or ladders because.
Yes, they use ropes. they did use ropes in 9 Mile Canyon. They used ropes. They found one of those ropes in 9 Mile Canyon. So yes, they did use ropes in some places, and ladders too. Ladders are different than what we would think. If you've been to Mesa Verde or stuff like that, you see how those steps go up on the single log. And then in some places they carve the steps into the rock. And in some things, like a climbing gym, I think that they were all creating, they're the predecessors of the climbing gyms that you see inside of most places. Because you see where the handholds are and where the toe holds are, and you can see that they could scale up there, that they actually created and carved those in. I don't go up those anymore. Just, you're not gonna do it. Because of lawsuits, you can't let your younger students do it either, because if they fall, yeah.
It seems like a lot of the rock art seems very intentional.
Yes.
But was there any graffiti?
Oh, did the First Nations do graffiti?
Yeah, like were there like kids running around? scratching
Well,
rocks?
they'll kill a spirit in one place where there's a contested landscape on the Colorado, Wyoming border. The Fremont extended that far. In the contested landscape, what you'll have is a real well done trapezoidal person, and then they kill the spirit of it. And over the top of it, they'll carve something from another group of people. So they kill the spirit of it. That's a little bit different than what you're describing as graffiti, but they will do that. The superimposition is what we call it. In some cases, you'll find 4 or 5 superimpositions on it, because what I think in those cases, it might be a powerful place, and it might be a thing that you want to make sure that you put your imprint on, or to show that you're there. Superimposition really gets me. As far as scribbling and doing that kind of stuff, I think you see more of that, like where the habitation is and little kids just drawing on it, but not necessarily on the rock art itself. The main thing that I see, you wouldn't call it vandalism, but it's superimposition, because you're trying to kill the spirit of the power of that. On Easter Island, they call it taking the mana. They believe everything has mana, which is power. All stones have mana and stuff like this. So they'll deface some of those items that are there. In Rome, which I don't want to get too far afield of this, when the Visigoths and the Vandals came through there, those statues that fell over, they knocked off the people's noses to deface them and steal the power from the individual. In the case of the Easter Island, when you're superimposing something on something, you're trying to steal or seal the power from that particular individual. I don't want to extrapolate that to the Colorado Basin, but there's got to be some thought brought into that as to what's happening. But as far as, like Sam was here, that comes, you don't see that too much.
Dudley, we've got a question from Zoom.
Okay,
Was the clay that was used to seal the granary brought up from the valley floor, or was it collected next to the site?
from the valley floor. And the reason we know this is we took and did pollen samples from the maize. We did all kinds of experiments with it, which I don't have time to go into now. It's in the later slides here. But we took the pollen out of that. And what we found was willow pollen, and we found pollen from the wetlands there. So we know that it came from by where the water was and where the mud was. Where mud and water was together, you carry the heaviest thing the least furthest, and you mix those together there. And the pollens are from riverine environments. They're not from the higher environments. So we do know that they came from most of it. The stuff that we've analyzed, we have to limit that. I have to provide myself with a way out. The stuff that we've analyzed and came from down in the bottom of the floodplains where the streams are.
Is that what they're calling daub then?
Yeah, daub. So we use it. We use it mortar, daub, adobe. So we use those interchangeably. Sometimes you'll find people using cement, but cement means something very special. It's a different thing. It's got that high lime in it, and it's had that calcium carbonate, whatever that is, that's been heated up and stuff like that. So cement's got that high temperature, and it had to go through the temperature, the kilning process to create the cement. So we stop it off when it has to be heated up. Then it stops being a mortar, a daub, or an adobe. Yeah, there's actually a scientific reason for stopping it at that.
On the same topic, just the adobe, you mentioned the modeling daub type and what you call the coil type.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is so much a question, but the coil type, I imagine, is the same thing as like turtlebacks.
Yes, turtlebacks, yeah.
Right.
Most turtlebacks are made out of that, and then what
Dudley,
happens?
you'll have to repeat what he's saying so the folks online
Okay,
can hear.
so what he asked about, he says, is that adobe, the coiled adobe, is that a turtleback? And yes, that's turtleback. So in those cases where you have that real smooth granary that was in the first slide that you saw, they'll take and coil it up, and then they'll take and put moisture over the top of it and run it with their hands and smooth it down. But the interior of that is that turtleback, or is that coil. The turtleback comes by smoothing it out. We usually call turtlebacks the smooth type of granary. So that has been smoothed down. You can't see the coils. It's been smoothed and finished.
So those are the two types of adobe, there's no other types, of course, adobe.
Yeah, there's other types
I
too.
mean, in your study, in these granaries, are all the early adobe is either wattle and daub or
Oh, yeah, turtleback, or what they do is they do the coursing with the mortar. So we have some that are dry laid with no mortar. So that would be a different style. So there's no mortar there. Then be some that's just for chinking. That might be coiled stuff that they brought up there, but then that was just put in chinking. So we define it in coiled, wattle and daub, dry laid, and then wet laid masonry. So those are the four basic ones. There's others too. Archaeologists like to make up terms, and so if we discover it first and it's different than what I just described, then we yeah.
A lot of the turtlebacks, the intervals.
Yeah.
Somebody must be trying to grow the corn, beans, the crops.
Yeah, so
Preserve the genetics.
and I think they're very good geneticists. I think they understand it. They, especially with the Peruvians, which we have, the Incas, which we have more information about. We know how much genetic experimentation they did. And in one of the places, they actually have an experimental farm where they saw which would grow better at what elevation. So they knew which type of corn. And I think that there in the Botany of Desire, it tells how many different types of potatoes that the Incas actually hybrid and created. And it's a beautiful book to read when you read that. It's called the Botany of Desire. So we know that they're doing experimentation here too. And they did not have monocrops, and I left that out because time, but they would plant chenopodium beside it, sunflowers, and then whatever else that could grow right there. But they had sunflowers, they had chenopodium, and they had maize. And if they had beans, now beans don't grow as well here as they do there as they do here. So they wouldn't have beans, but they'd have beans commingled with those things because you could fix the legumes in the ground with the beans. So by having these whole things there, and there's some of the plants that they put there that drove off the insects, like I think it's daisies, you guys have to tell me because I forget what it is, marigolds, to keep the insects off of the corn. So they would tend to, now the people who watched the corn were the old and the young. And what would happen is game comes in to eat the animals. So that's okay. Let them get comfortable and shoot them. Because then you've got protein right there. So it's just a benign, catching, not, way of hunting. Yeah.
Is there evidence in this specific study area that they stored beans in these?
Beans were not stored here like here. So beans are not stored in the Upper Colorado River Basin like they are here. In fact, we have very few beans, but I'll tell you what we have found in analysis of the fecal material. Yeah, because they don't lie, we found cotton. And so we have found diversity with inside of it. So they traded for cotton from down here. So they probably traded for beans. But we don't have beans up there. They relied on chenopodium to substitute for beans because beans are high in lysine and chenopodium is really, really good and nutritious and has the proteins that you need and the lysine that you need. So that's substituted for the bean up north. Good question. That's a very good question.
I'm just, you've done a lot of thinking about the locations.
Right. Yeah.
And down here in the southern Colorado Plateau, I'm familiar with when I see higher elevation granaries, in particular, just individual seed pods in a crevice that you'd never see.
Yeah, right.
Just hidden there. I've sometimes wondered whether they're related to the specific, whether they're maintaining a genetic diversity.
Possibly.
Because I haven't really thought of them as going to the top to store it and hide it.
Yeah.
So much as using those seeds on the mesa tops.
But yes.
And down here you have the mesa tops.
Yeah, so you have the mesa tops. We do too. But so you have the mesa tops. So you want to see what grows at the different elevations and stuff like that. So there's experimentation. That's good. That's good insight right there, what you're saying. So you would take that and put it up there to do the experimentation. They were experimenters. And they were very good. Yeah.
Obviously would take a different corn that does well down there where it might flood
Yeah.
versus the one up there where has a short growing season,
But-
you know?
When we wanted to do the genetic analysis of it, and that's still going to come eventually, when we wanted to do the genetic analysis of these corn cobs here, we wanted to see if they were tolerant to alkali, because there's a lot of alkali in the soil. We want to see if tolerant to alkali, if they had shorter growing season, and what the rows were. And I didn't mention that at Kelby, and I should have. I meant to. We had an 18-row corn cob up there, which is the same as that you get with a Hopi. So they had corn that was growing to a full season that would have the maybe close to the 90-day germination up there. But that would probably be down the valley floors, down more on the White River. But they did have 18-row corn. That's an exception. It's usually 12, I think it is. I have a botanist that does this for me. So I try not to tell lies as I go. So I don't remember if it's 12-row or if it's 8-row, but I think it's 12-row. But the 18-row was exceptional. It's like what you get with a Hopi corn, meaning you have longer growing season. Yeah.
Dudley, we have a couple more questions from Zoom.
Okay.
First one is, how does charcoal keep insects away from the food stores? And then the second one is, please define dry farming. Was irrigation involved?
Dry farming, no irrigation, you rely completely on the rains. So there was, in one place, I think I might have had irrigation, but that's because the Piance Creek is right beside where the field would be, but we have no evidence of canals or anything else being put there. We think that they relied basically on water from, the creek is so high that they relied on the roots being driven down to the water level. They didn't have to go too deep. So it was kind of like natural irrigation. So dry farming is no irrigation. That's what that particular one means. And the second question was the other one.
How does charcoal keep insects away
Okay,
from
so
the
insects don't like charcoal. In fact, you find that in old houses. We've excavated a stage station that burned down. And it floored me, literally, this is kind of double entendre. It floored me because what they did was they just left the charcoal there, and then they covered it with adobe. And so it kind of raised the floor a little bit, but they just left the beams in there. So when we were doing the excavation, we had a person that was with us, and they said the reason they did that is because they had problem with insects in most historical houses. They had problems with all kinds of things, bed bugs, et cetera, like this. Insects don't do well with charcoal. They just don't like charcoal. They don't like the smell of it. They just, they realize fire is deadly. It could be the chemicals in the charcoal too, but usually you can keep the insects down with the charcoal, especially the ones that might be boring into like the corn or stuff like this. And I do know it's a pretty good system. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'd have to look up the chemistry to find out exactly what it is that drives them away.
Was there any evidence of like different construction methods or materials depending on what was being stored in the granaries?
Yes, yes and no. I think the main thing that they did was try to blend in with the environment around them. So they took what was locally available. And I will go with that old rule that the only rule an archaeologist have that actually holds, you carry the heaviest thing the least farthest. When it's multiple things that are heavy, you try to make it so that you have access to it. So in some cases, I thought that those narrow slabs were something that were readily available. I couldn't find narrow slabs. So that defeats that argument right there. So I think it was stored there because they wanted to leave that long term. The ones that are better made, I think that they want to make sure that that granary wasn't broken into. Yeah.
I was just hypothesizing that they used all the narrow slabs and they don't grow back.
Yeah, they don't grow back. Yeah, they don't have crop every year. Well, thank you. Oh, wait,
They store their food, their corn in pots or just within the granary itself?
So this is a real good question. Down here, you have a real robust ceramic tradition. So you do have ceramics that are here. We have such a low ceramic tradition that we excavated a Fremont house that the rock shelter fell down on it. And we had to remove 3 tons of rock off the top of it to get to the house. Inside of there were 64 ceramics there that included a tray, that included effigies, and they included spoons, all kinds of things. So we took and did thermonuclear analysis on it in Missouri. I can't remember Jeff's last name. I got myself in a cul-de-sac here, but he's one of our students. He did it basically for free for us. And we found out it was made from local clays. And I would think that they would make those pots to store the corn in. But I think what they made the pots for, it was either for cooking, for not for cooking, but for putting food on and for carrying water. I think that for storage, they just relied on hides. This has, up north, you have a better hide tradition, because that's one thing that I didn't have a chance to get into, but some other time. They had a buffalo herd there. At that site that I talked about that caved in, they killed 2 bison just down the hill from there, because the parts of the bison that they brought up to the cave to process, you don't carry very far. You just, they're the big thigh bones, the hip bone, everything, well, they're the femurs and et cetera like that, but they're the whole femurs. They're not part of the femur, they're the whole femur. If you're getting them from a far distance, by then you've taken the meat off, you reduced it down, you carry just back the meat and the jerky and stuff like that. They carried the whole bones up there. And bone is good for processing and for marrow. I should tell you this. For those of that I give the cook talk to, I'm doing this for you, Mike. We just did the bone analysis of it. We found that they had taken coyote bone and cut them into discs to make for beads. So we have coyote bone beads in that they cook there. But that's from an older lecture. It's an inside joke, not really. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.